The villagers clustered around the empty display case, voices rising and falling like waves over a stone shore. Miss Agnes Whittington's face was pale, her hands shaking as she fumbled to right the overturned chairs and to gather the scattered remnants of her afternoon tea. "It must have been someone from here," she whispered to no one in particular, her eyes darting about as if expecting the doll itself to speak. "No one else could have gotten in without being seen. I didn't hear a thing." Miss Marple remained seated beneath the chestnut tree, the sunlight catching the glint of her spectacles. She observed calmly, knitting needles clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm that belied the sharpness of her attention. Already she had noticed details that the excitement of the crowd threatened to obscure. The slight smear of mud on the hem of Mr. Peters's carefully pressed trousers, the peculiar nervous tug of Mrs. Peters's apron as she fussed over her spilled lemonade, and the way young Lucy Beecham lingered at the edge of the circle, her fingers brushing absent-mindedly against a ribbon she had not yet pinned on her doll. "Such a shame," murmured Mrs. Price, who had arrived with her husband in their new motor car, her tone a mix of horror and delight. "One can hardly imagine anyone taking something so delicate and in broad daylight, too." She fluttered her fan as though the gentle motion might soothe the turmoil around her. "Delicate indeed," agreed her husband, a man of impressive girth and solemn brow. "Who would do such a thing? One hardly thinks of St. Mary Mead as a place for petty crime." "Petty crime or not, someone has done it," Miss Marple replied softly, though her voice was not directed at them. She had learned long ago that conversation in St. Mary Mead tended to follow its own course, one that revealed far more than it concealed. People talked, and in their talking, they exposed themselves, sometimes accidentally, sometimes in the very heat of indignation. Constable Harris arrived shortly thereafter, his notebook already in hand. He was a young man, eager, conscientious, and somewhat overwhelmed by the rapid escalation of events. "I need statements from everyone present," he said, a note of authority in his voice that seemed both necessary and hopelessly inadequate. "Has anyone noticed anything unusual? Suspicious behavior? Anything at all?" Voices clamored to answer simultaneously, creating a tangled cacophony of observations. Mr. Stringer was particularly vehement. "I saw no one near the doll. I was at my stall the whole time, and my tomatoes—" He gestured as though his produce might bear witness to his honesty. "Well, I assure you, nothing escaped my attention." "I only saw Lucy staring at it," interjected Mrs. Peters, a sharp edge of accusation in her voice. "She's been a mischievous child from birth, always pressing her luck. I shouldn't be surprised if she—" Miss Marple's knitting paused for a fraction of a second. She noted the direction of Lucy's gaze, the tiny curve of her lips, the innocent way she held the ribbon as if it were evidence of nothing at all. Children, she reflected, often absorbed far more than adults assumed. Yet equally, their innocence could be a clever shield. The constable, attempting to regain control, raised a hand. "I'll need calm here, please. Everyone take a breath and tell me exactly what you saw, in order." Even as he spoke, the crowd's attention had shifted. Mrs. Peters was now wringing her hands in agitation. Mr. Stringer's face flushed, and Miss Whittington seemed unable to tear her eyes away from the empty case, as if the doll had vanished into thin air and taken part of her very soul with it. Miss Marple, however, was quietly noting patterns. She considered the layout of the stalls, the positions of the children and adults, the minor mud smears, and the small but telling inconsistencies in people's movements. She observed Mrs. Price repeatedly glancing at the exit gate, as though considering whether a visitor might have left unnoticed. She noticed a faint scuff mark near the edge of the tent, almost imperceptible, where the grass had been trampled in a strange, looping pattern. Then there was the matter of the doll itself, the careful glass case, designed to protect against casual handling, and the padlock that had been left slightly ajar. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked in the rush of panic, but Miss Marple filed it away in her mind. Few would think to exploit such a small lapse, yet in her experience, the smallest opening often revealed the most. The villagers' voices rose again, accusations flying like sparks from a fire. It must have been someone greedy. A thief from outside, I tell you. How could such a thing happen in our peaceful village? And all the while, Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting and observing, her mind forming gentle, unspoken hypotheses. She could feel in the rhythm of her own calm that the theft was not random, nor was it a mere trifle. Someone had acted deliberately, and the reason would be found not in the doll itself, but in the tangled web of human desire, envy, and long-held resentment that wove through the heart of St. Mary Mead. She made a mental note to speak later with Miss Whittington about the doll's history, to ask indirect questions of the children, and to watch closely the adults whose agitation seemed out of proportion. For Miss Marple, every tremor of the hand, every flicker of the eye, and every hurried word was a piece of a puzzle, one that she intended to solve, quietly and with her usual subtle genius. As the constable attempted to restore order, Miss Marple's gaze swept the assembled villagers. The doll had disappeared. The panic was real, but she already sensed, with that calm certainty born of long observation, that the true story was only beginning, and that the thief's identity would not be discovered through force or confrontation, but through the delicate and patient reading of human nature. And so, beneath the gentle shade of the chestnut tree, Miss Marple settled once more to her knitting, watching, listening, and letting the mystery unfurl at its own curious pace. The villagers, still clustered about the empty display case, began to settle into their familiar roles in the aftermath of shock. Gossip, like a tide, rose steadily, carrying with it speculation, conjecture, and the occasional outright accusation. Mrs. Price, determined to assert moral authority, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, loud enough for several others to hear, that surely such an incident could only have been perpetrated by someone new to the village or of particularly questionable upbringing. Her husband nodded solemnly, as though he had long suspected that St. Mary Mead's peace rested on a very thin veneer. Miss Marple, seated under her chestnut tree, observed the scene with patient attention. The constable was taking statements, yet the villagers were far more interested in discussing one another than in aiding the investigation. Mr. Stringer had taken up a position beside Miss Whittington, insisting she recount the doll's provenance in meticulous detail. "It belonged to my great-aunt, you know," she explained for the third time. "She was an avid collector, and this particular doll was made by—" Her voice faltered as Mr. Stringer interrupted with a pointed question about the security of the glass case. Meanwhile, Lucy Beecham, undeterred by the constable's reminders to stay still, flitted about from group to group, offering opinions that were at once innocent and unsettling. "I think someone wanted it for themselves," she said, tilting her head as she spoke to Mrs. Peters. "It's prettier than my dolls, don't you think?" The adult smiled indulgently, not noticing the way her words drew a thin, almost imperceptible frown across Lucy's small brow. Miss Marple's eyes followed each movement, noting subtle gestures, a flick of the wrist, a hesitant step backward, a glance that lingered too long on the empty case. Human nature, she thought, was rarely as it appeared on the surface. The most seemingly innocent villagers often bore the heaviest shadows, and it was precisely those shadows she intended to study. "Perhaps we ought to consider who had the opportunity," Mrs. Peters suggested, loud enough to draw the attention of half the crowd. "It had to be someone close enough to the store while Miss Agnes wasn't looking. That narrows it down, doesn't it?" "Yes, but not nearly enough to identify the culprit," Miss Marple muttered to herself. Opportunity, after all, was a necessary condition, but hardly a sufficient one. Character, motive, and the slightest slip of behavior would provide far more telling clues than mere proximity. She made a quiet mental note of the villagers' positions during the commotion, imagining the angles of vision, the possible distractions, and the few moments when the case might have been vulnerable. Constable Harris, attempting to impose order, turned his attention to the adults most likely to have been near the doll. "Now, Mrs. Peters, Mr. Stringer, did either of you notice anyone acting strangely? Anyone behaving out of character?" Mrs. Peters wrung her hands. "Well, I suppose—" Mr. Peters seemed a little fidgety, she admitted hesitantly. And Mrs. Price, she kept glancing toward the gate as though— Miss Marple caught the flicker of discomfort on Mrs. Price's face and the subtle tightening of her husband's jaw. A glance toward the gate could mean many things: expectation, fear, or planning. The clue alone was insufficient to accuse, but it was not without significance. She filed it quietly, storing each reaction like a carefully pressed flower, knowing that the arrangement would reveal itself in time. Lucy Beecham, sensing the heightened attention, began to speak again, this time addressing the constable directly. "I think someone tall could have reached over the case, perhaps while everyone was looking at the cakes," she said, eyes wide as though sharing a profound insight. Constable Harris nodded, appreciative of any hint, and Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The child had noticed the detail without fully understanding it, and that was precisely the kind of observation adults often overlooked in their desire to assert control. Meanwhile, whispers rippled through the crowd about potential motives. Some believed the theft to be an act of envy, perhaps a rival collector from another village, or a local whose own possessions had never been appreciated. Others were more imaginative, suggesting that the doll had some hidden value, perhaps a jewel or secret letter concealed within its delicate frame. Miss Marple, of course, took note of every theory without comment, aware that it was less the truth of these speculations that mattered and more the manner in which they were offered. Human speech, she reflected, often betrayed the speaker far more than the subject of their words. As the constable scribbled notes and the villagers continued to speculate, Miss Marple allowed herself a small satisfaction. The situation was unfolding exactly as it always did in her experience. Panic would bring out petty resentments, loyalties would reveal themselves in small gestures, and the guilty, or the clever, would reveal tiny cracks in their composure. Already she had observed inconsistencies in behavior, glances that lingered too long, steps that faltered when attention turned elsewhere, subtle evasions in speech. Each would serve as a thread, and she intended to follow them to the very heart of the matter. The stolen doll, Miss Marple realized, was far more than a simple trinket. It was the catalyst, the lens through which the hidden life of St. Mary Mead could be examined. Beneath the laughter, the polite conversation, and the outward calm of the village fete lay passions, grievances, and desires that few acknowledged openly. And in that quiet, ever-attentive way she possessed, Miss Marple would begin the careful process of unraveling them, stitch by subtle stitch, until the mystery revealed itself. Not through force or confrontation, but through the patient observation of the people whose secrets the doll had exposed. And as the villagers bickered and fretted, unaware of the small, meticulous scrutiny under which they now fell, Miss Marple returned her attention to her knitting. Each stitch, deliberate and precise, was mirrored in her thoughts. Slowly, quietly, the pattern of the day's events began to take shape in her mind. She knew the theft was only the beginning, and that before the truth emerged, the village would have to reveal itself in all its curious, tangled complexity. By the late afternoon, the excitement of the fete had dwindled to a low hum, the villagers lingering in small clusters, whispering and casting curious glances at one another. Miss Marple, still seated beneath the chestnut tree, watched as the constable methodically went about his questioning. He had begun with the obvious, those nearest the doll when the commotion occurred, but even in those preliminary inquiries, a pattern of subtle unease emerged that went unnoticed by all except her. Mr. Stringer, now pacing along the edge of the green, kept muttering about the impossibility of someone entering unnoticed, as though by sheer repetition he could make the theft impossible. He shook his head and gestured at Miss Whittington, who remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I cannot imagine anyone daring to touch such a priceless item," he exclaimed, oblivious to the way his agitation betrayed him. Mrs. Peters, meanwhile, had taken up a position near the refreshment table, arranging her lemonade cups with a nervous precision. Each time she straightened a tray, her eyes flickered toward Mr. Peters, who busied himself with wiping a spill on the grass, yet repeatedly glanced at the remaining stalls as if anticipating something or someone. Miss Marple noted the subtle coordination of their movements, the faint tension in their posture, and the way Mrs. Peters's voice sometimes carried a forced cheer when speaking to neighbors. Lucy Beecham, for her part, remained unusually silent, seated on a low bench beside the flower beds. Miss Marple observed her closely. The child's hands fidgeted with a ribbon she had not tied, and her gaze lingered on the empty glass case. There was curiosity there, certainly, but also something else, an intensity, a quiet recklessness that suggested she noticed far more than she should. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her gently. Children, she knew, were often unwitting witnesses to events adults preferred to conceal. It was in the middle of these observations that the first obvious suspect began to emerge, not through any overt admission, but through the way the villagers themselves directed attention. Mrs. Price, ever eager to assign blame externally, leaned conspiratorially toward a small circle of neighbors. "I dare say it must be that new governess, Miss Fairchild. I've seen her sneaking glances at Miss Agnes's collection before, and one cannot trust outsiders to respect our village's proprieties." The name rippled through the crowd, and soon others nodded in agreement, adding their own imagined transgressions. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting how quickly suspicion could be manufactured and how eagerly it was embraced when it confirmed pre-existing biases. She observed the subtle tightening of Miss Fairchild's shoulders as the whispers reached her ears, her polite attempts to smile and excuse herself doing little to mask her discomfort. Constable Harris, encouraged by the seemingly unanimous consensus, made a brief approach toward the governess, asking whether she had noticed anything unusual. Miss Fairchild's response was careful, precise, and outwardly polite. Yet Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her hand as she touched her parasol, a tiny sign of nervousness that could mean any number of things, or nothing at all. While the crowd rallied around the theory of the outsider's guilt, Miss Marple's attention drifted to the subtler details. The uneven footprints near the tent, the faint traces of grass, disturbed in a pattern that did not match anyone's path she had already observed, and the glances exchanged between villagers who claimed to have been wholly occupied elsewhere. Each observation was like a stitch in a larger tapestry, and she began to see a design forming that was invisible to the panicked crowd. The discussion among the villagers grew increasingly heated. "It simply could not have been one of us," insisted Mr. Stringer, almost stamping his foot. "Who in their right mind would risk such a scandal?" "Precisely the point," muttered Mrs. Peters, in a tone that suggested both insight and thinly veiled accusation. "The boldest among us are often the ones least suspected, and sometimes the boldness comes not from opportunity, but from long-held resentment." Miss Marple's eyes brightened ever so slightly at that remark. Resentment, she knew, was far more dangerous than casual curiosity. The smallest grievance, left to fester in silence, could motivate acts that seemed utterly out of character to the casual observer. Already she could think of several villagers whose polite facades concealed minor irritations, slights, or rivalries that might explain the audacity required to lift a doll in broad daylight. Even as the constable attempted to calm the rising debate, Miss Marple took quiet note of the social undercurrents. Mr. Peters' preoccupation with the spill was excessive, almost performative. Mrs. Price's insistence on blaming an outsider hinted at a discomfort with the idea that one of their own might be culpable, and young Lucy's fixed attention on the empty case suggested she had witnessed more than she was willing or able to articulate. By late afternoon, the initial panic had given way to a murmur of suspicion and conjecture. Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, as it always did, arranging each clue, each gesture, each glance into a coherent pattern. Opportunity and motive, she reminded herself, were only part of the picture. The true solution would come from understanding human nature, from observing how individuals reacted under scrutiny, from noting the smallest inconsistencies in behavior and temperament. As the shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple's knitting continued, each click of the needles a metronome to the rhythm of her thoughts. The stolen doll had revealed itself to be far more than a simple trinket. It was a lens through which the hidden lives of St. Mary Mead could be examined, and she, patient and attentive, would follow each thread of observation, drawing closer with every careful step to uncovering not merely the thief, but the human truth behind the theft. The day wore on, the fate's cheerful clamor now tinged with an air of unease. Miss Marple remained beneath her chestnut tree, knitting quietly while her eyes wandered, absorbing the village's subtle motions and whispered conjectures. The constable's notebook was filling with hurried statements, yet he appeared to sense, as Miss Marple did, that the truth lay in places far less obvious than a direct confession. What mattered now were the minor details, the gestures and glances, the slight hesitations in speech that revealed more than any declaration could. Miss Marple's attention returned repeatedly to the doll's empty case. The padlock, she had noted before, was slightly ajar. Yet upon closer inspection now, a finer detail became apparent, a barely perceptible scratch along the edge of the glass, one that had not been caused by accident or careless handling. It was so faint that few would notice it, and none of the villagers had remarked upon it. But to Miss Marple, accustomed as she was to observing the minutiae of human behavior and physical surroundings alike, it was an essential clue. The scratch suggested care rather than haste, deliberate movement rather than random mischief. Whoever had taken the doll had known precisely how to avoid detection while manipulating the case. Nearby, Mr. Stringer continued to fume, pacing in short, tense strides as he recounted to anyone who would listen the series of supposed failures in village vigilance. "A theft like this should never have happened under our very eyes," he bellowed. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, not for the indignation he expressed so loudly, but for the tiny inconsistencies in his narrative. He insisted he had remained at his stall the entire time, yet his shoes bore traces of the soft mud near the tent, a place he claimed not to have crossed. Mrs. Peters, still fussing with her lemonade cups, had now begun to speculate on the psychology of the thief, her voice rising slightly with excitement. "Perhaps it was someone who has long felt overlooked," she murmured, glancing meaningfully at the surrounding villagers. "A person who craved recognition, or perhaps revenge. It is amazing what even a small object can provoke in people." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, noting how quickly human imagination could shape a narrative. Opportunity and motive, she reflected, could easily be conflated, leading to conclusions that were plausible but entirely inaccurate. She considered the villagers' prior interactions, minor disputes over garden plots, rivalries over social status, lingering resentments from years past. Each potential motive had its own subtle signature in behavior, and it was these signatures she now studied with quiet intensity. Lucy Beecham, ever restless, had moved closer to the tent, crouching beside the remaining chairs, and ran a small finger along the edge of the case. Miss Marple noticed the child's fascination, but also the way her eyes occasionally flicked toward adults, measuring reactions. Children, she knew, observed with a directness that adults rarely allowed themselves. They noticed inconsistencies in a way that seemed intuitive, almost instinctive. Yet Lucy's observations were too unformed, too unspoken to constitute evidence. Still, the attention she drew from others was revealing. A nervous glance from Mrs. Peters, a tightened jaw on Mr. Peters, these were indicators of consciousness, of the mind's quiet acknowledgement of matters best kept hidden. Constable Harris, growing increasingly flustered, moved from group to group, questioning anyone whose proximity to the doll could be construed as significant. Miss Marple, however, had already begun her own, far subtler method of inquiry. She engaged villagers in casual conversation, listening more than speaking, allowing her questions to drift into observations about weather, crops, or the latest parish news. Through these seemingly innocuous exchanges, she gathered impressions, a hesitation, a slip of a phrase, a too eager denial, all hints pointing toward hidden truths. It was in this way that she returned, almost unnoticed, to Miss Whittington herself. The elderly lady's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves, her gaze repeatedly flicking to the empty case. Miss Marple offered a quiet, sympathetic observation about the heat of the day and the effort required to manage a fete. Miss Whittington, reassured by the gentle tone, began to speak freely about the doll's history, its journey from one collector to another, and her own apprehensions about lending it for public display. Among the anecdotes, Miss Marple detected subtle tension when certain villagers' names were mentioned. Names that otherwise seemed innocuous, yet caused the slightest furrow of the brow or the faintest hitch in the voice. The scratch on the case, minor as it seemed, became a focal point in her mind. It suggested someone who knew how to handle delicate objects, someone accustomed to working carefully and deliberately rather than clumsily seizing what they coveted. Opportunity alone was insufficient. The thief had skill, composure, and an understanding of human distraction. These were not traits one would assign lightly, and Miss Marple began to narrow her mental list accordingly, noting which villagers displayed such characteristics in small, ordinary ways. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple's mind quietly wove together the threads of observation, behavioral nuance, and the small but significant evidence that most others dismissed. The theft was no random act, nor the work of a child acting on whim. It was deliberate, calculated, and executed with precision. Whoever had taken the doll had done so with knowledge of both the object's value and the human dynamics at play, a combination that promised to reveal its perpetrator in time, if one only knew how to watch and wait. And so, while the fete continued in a subdued fashion, with villagers whispering theories and the constable noting statements, Miss Marple continued her patient scrutiny. Each gesture, each glance, each faint sign of agitation was recorded in her mind with meticulous care. The hidden clue, so minor that none besides herself had noticed it, had already begun to guide her thoughts, illuminating the path that would eventually lead to the truth behind the curious affair of the antique doll. By the time the fete drew to a close, the village green had quieted, though the air remained thick with whispered speculation. Miss Marple had observed nearly every movement, every glance, and now she turned her attention to the subtler signs of unease that persisted among the villagers. The constable had departed to file preliminary reports, leaving the villagers to mill about, some reluctant to leave, others eager to avoid further scrutiny. It was in this hour of subdued tension that long-buried resentments began to surface, revealing motives that had remained hidden beneath polite conversation and social courtesy. Mr. Stringer, still red-faced and muttering about village vigilance, took the opportunity to speak directly with Mrs. Peters, who had been fussing with the remaining cups. "Did you notice anything odd when Miss Agnes was arranging the doll?" he asked, in a tone of barely concealed suspicion. Mrs. Peters tilted her head thoughtfully, as if recalling details she had not yet shared. "Well, I suppose," she began hesitantly. "There were moments earlier this morning when Mr. Peters seemed unusually interested in the doll, not in a helpful way, but watching." Miss Marple, seated at a discreet distance, allowed her knitting to rest in her lap as she noted the exchange. The Peters' marital dynamics, always slightly fraught beneath a surface of civility, could now take on a sharper hue. Mr. Peters, mild-mannered in appearance, had displayed subtle signs of envy in small domestic matters over the years, and Mrs. Peters's keen awareness of these tensions made her observations particularly valuable. The potential for resentment to translate into action, even for something as small as a doll, was considerable. Nearby, Miss Whittington, still holding her gloves tightly, confided in a neighbor about a long-standing disagreement she had had with Mrs. Price over the preservation of local traditions. "She never approved of lending items from my collection," Miss Whittington said in a low voice. "Always fretting that someone might mishandle them, that they'd be taken for frivolous display, and yet she seemed so eager to assign blame elsewhere." The comment was casual, almost offhand. Yet Miss Marple caught the slight narrowing of her eyes, the minuscule lift of one eyebrow, a subtle signal of unspoken tension and personal grievance. Lucy Beecham had moved again, now lingering near the garden path, where a few late-arriving visitors were walking. Miss Marple observed the child's interactions closely. Lucy had been silent since the morning commotion, yet her eyes were wide, absorbing every adult gesture, every twitch of emotion. When Mrs. Price passed her, Lucy's gaze lingered a moment longer than politeness required, and her small fingers toyed with the ribbon in a way that suggested nervous anticipation. Children, Miss Marple reminded herself, often perceived truth before adults did. The challenge was interpreting their innocent, imprecise signals. Across the green, Mrs. Price herself had begun to weave a narrative for anyone who would listen, highlighting past perceived slights and minor social injustices. "It has always seemed to me," she said, adjusting her fan, "that some villagers act as if propriety applies to all except themselves. One must be cautious when dealing with such people, for envy and pride can lead to unfortunate decisions." Miss Marple noted the deliberate choice of words, recognizing in them both a warning and a reflection of her own social awareness. The adult mind, she knew, often projected hidden motives onto others, even as it concealed them within its own heart. The afternoon shadows lengthened, and Miss Marple's gaze returned to the faint scratch on the doll's glass case. She considered, quietly, which villagers possessed the combination of careful skill and deliberate attention necessary to exploit such an opening. The careful preparation required suggested familiarity with delicate objects, and the act of taking the doll without leaving more obvious traces implied patience, composure, and perhaps a quiet cunning that would not easily be detected by casual observation. Miss Marple rose slowly, adjusting her shawl, and began a measured stroll among the lingering villagers. She engaged in gentle conversation, commenting on the roses along the path, asking about the late-arriving teas, and praising the summer's weather. In every casual remark, she allowed her mind to absorb reactions, noting subtle inconsistencies between words and expressions. Mr. Stringer stiffened slightly when she mentioned the garden arrangements. Mrs. Peters's smile faltered ever so briefly when she spoke of the tea service, and Lucy Beecham's eyes flickered toward a side path as though measuring escape routes. The old detective and Miss Marple quietly catalogued each human signal, each small deviation from ordinary comportment. Past slights, whispered grievances, and private rivalries, the invisible threads of village life, were now illuminated by the stress of the theft. Where some villagers saw only a missing object, Miss Marple saw the latent ambitions, resentments, and insecurities that could motivate an otherwise unremarkable individual to act. Finally, she returned to Miss Whittington, who seemed more composed yet still anxious. "Tell me, Miss Whittington," Miss Marple asked gently, "has anyone ever shown an unusual interest in your collection? Small hints, perhaps, that they might covet something without admitting it?" The old lady paused, considering. "Well, there was someone, years ago," she said quietly. "But I thought little of it at the time. They always seemed polite enough, and I never expected it would matter now." Miss Marple nodded slightly, her mind already connecting the subtle signals she had accumulated throughout the day. The doll was the spark, yes, but it was the hidden grievances, the minute shifts in behavior, and the small personal histories that would ultimately illuminate the identity of the thief. She returned to her knitting under the chestnut tree, satisfied that in time the pattern would become clear. It was never a matter of force. Observation and patience revealed everything, and in that calm, deliberate silence, Miss Marple felt certain that the story of the stolen doll, and of the human hearts that had covetously watched it, was beginning to unfold stitch by careful stitch into a picture that only she could fully perceive. The evening fell over St. Mary Mead with a gentle hush, the golden sunlight fading into a soft, cool glow that made the village green appear smaller, more intimate and yet more secretive than it had seemed during the bustle of the fete. Miss Marple, still beneath her chestnut tree, had resumed her knitting, though her eyes wandered constantly, noting even the smallest gestures among the villagers who lingered. The heat of the day had passed, leaving behind a different kind of tension, a quiet anticipation that the thief might be discovered or that the stolen doll might be returned. Yet Miss Marple knew that in situations such as this, revelation came rarely by chance and almost never quickly. Across the green, Mr. Stringer had seated himself heavily on a bench, muttering about security and vigilance, while Mrs. Peters fussed with the last remaining lemonade cups, ensuring none were out of place. The constable had returned briefly, seeking to calm a few late arrivals who had heard of the theft and were eager to offer their own speculative accounts. Each new voice, each newly remembered detail, Miss Marple absorbed with careful attention, recognizing that truth rarely came in grand declarations, but rather in the tiny inconsistencies, the slips of tongue, the unguarded expressions that most people overlooked. It was then that a new disturbance broke the fragile calm. A scream, not of shock, but of discovery, rang from the path near the edge of the village green. Miss Marple's head turned instinctively, and her knitting paused. A small crowd began to gather near the path, where Lucy Beecham stood, holding something in her hands, a small folded piece of paper, crumpled at the edges, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "What have you found, child?" Miss Marple asked, rising to approach. Lucy's voice trembled as she handed the note to her gently. I found it behind the hedge," she said. "I was just walking, and it was there. I think someone dropped it." Miss Marple carefully unfolded the paper, observing the neat, precise handwriting that filled the page. It was a note, brief but significant, referencing the doll and hinting at a meeting that had been planned the previous evening. The contents suggested knowledge not available to most of the villagers, details that only someone who had been intimately involved with the doll or its theft could have known. Miss Marple's mind began to work, quietly, arranging possibilities, weighing motives, and considering the human dynamics revealed by the note. The crowd murmured, eager for interpretation, but Miss Marple held up her hand to forestall comment. "It seems someone has left a message," she said softly. "We must consider carefully what it implies before drawing conclusions." Her tone was calm, yet carried a quiet authority, and the villagers fell silent, sensing that the moment required measured thought. Mr. Stringer, however, could not contain his indignation. "This proves it!" he exclaimed. "A thief among us, a schemer who dares to manipulate our entire village." His voice, raised and accusatory, drew quick glances from those nearby, some uncomfortable, others curious. Miss Marple observed the way his eyes flicked toward Mrs. Peters, who met his gaze with a subtle lift of the chin, not defensive, but equally guarded. Small exchanges such as these, unnoticed by the constable, were often far more revealing than statements or confessions. The note, while seemingly straightforward, contained a subtle clue that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. The use of a phrase in the handwriting that was uncommon in everyday conversation, one that Miss Marple had heard before, in a context she now recalled with startling clarity. It was the kind of detail most would dismiss as trivial, but she knew that such subtleties were often the key to understanding the character and intentions of the writer. The combination of handwriting, phrasing, and the location where the note had been found suggested someone who both calculated their movements and understood the psychology of those they sought to mislead. Miss Whittington, still standing near the original display case, trembled slightly. "Oh, the audacity!" she exclaimed. "To leave a message after taking such a thing. I had never imagined anyone in our village capable of such scheming." Her voice carried more than indignation. It betrayed a deeper anxiety, a fear that someone she had trusted, or at least considered harmless, might now be implicated. Miss Marple observed the subtle flicker of recognition in her eyes as she glanced at several villagers, noting both the outward expressions of shock and the quiet undercurrents of tension beneath. Lucy, oblivious to much of the social interplay, remained close, her small hands still clutching the crumpled paper. Miss Marple knelt beside her for a moment, speaking in gentle, reassuring tones, drawing the child's attention to ordinary matters. The flowers along the hedge, the fading warmth of the sun, while silently reinforcing that Lucy's discovery had not gone unnoticed. The child's presence and her unguarded observation would prove invaluable in the days to come. As shadows lengthened further and the villagers began to disperse slowly, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The note had shifted the investigation, introducing a new layer of complexity. The theft was no longer a simple act of impulse. It was calculated, deliberate, and designed to provoke both panic and speculation. The careful planning implied by the note suggested familiarity, composure, and knowledge, qualities that immediately focused Miss Marple's attention on those who might exhibit such traits. Returning to her knitting, Miss Marple allowed her mind to assemble the fragments of the day. The empty case, the faint scratch, the villagers' gestures and inconsistencies, the whispered grievances and rivalries, and now the newly discovered note. Each element was a thread in a larger tapestry, one that required patience, observation, and subtle inference to unravel. She felt a quiet certainty, as always, that if she followed the threads carefully, the picture would become unmistakably clear, revealing both the method and the motive behind the curious affair of the antique doll. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to St. Mary Mead, yet it did little to settle the tension that lingered among its inhabitants. Miss Marple, as usual, had risen early, walking along the narrow lanes of the village with her knitting tucked neatly under her arm, observing the day's first movements. Windows opened cautiously, doors unlatched with care, and in several gardens she noted the small signs of unease. A gate latched more tightly than necessary, a shutter closed too quickly, or a glance that lingered with a hint of suspicion. Human nature, she reflected, rarely shifted overnight. The anxieties of yesterday continued to cast shadows on the present. At the village green, a small gathering had formed once more. Mrs. Price, now resolutely determined to exert authority, stood among her neighbors, recounting the discovery of the note with a dramatic flair that drew both admiration and exasperation. Mr. Stringer, flushed with indignation, hovered at her side, ready to endorse any conjecture that painted an outsider or someone of perceived lesser morality as the culprit. Miss Marple, settling herself on a familiar bench, allowed the villagers to speak, noting how their words were punctuated by subtle gestures. Tension in the jaw, a twitch of a hand, an avoidance of direct eye contact. These were the silent admissions of the human heart, far more revealing than the statements themselves. Lucy Beecham, unperturbed by the adult's commotion, had taken her position near the edge of the green. Miss Marple observed the child closely. She had watched Lucy's eyes flit from figure to figure, memorizing expressions as if unconsciously cataloguing every indication of unease or guilt. Children, she knew, perceived details without the filters adults imposed, and Lucy's presence, she realized, could serve as an unexpected mirror to the villagers' concealed thoughts. The constable, summoned once more, was attempting to restore a sense of procedure, requesting that each adult recount their whereabouts during the theft and whether anyone had behaved unusually. As statements were repeated, Miss Marple noticed discrepancies, small yet significant. Mr. Peters, who had insisted on his unwavering presence at the lemonade stand, seemed unaware of a footprint in the soft earth near the doll's display, one that suggested movement contrary to his account. Mrs. Peters' fingers twitched at her apron as she recounted her observations, betraying a nervous energy that she did not attempt to conceal fully. The note, now in Miss Marple's possession, continued to weigh in her mind. Its contents had introduced a new dimension, suggesting premeditation and the involvement of someone intimately aware of the doll's value and placement. That awareness, combined with the subtle scratch on the case observed previously, indicated a careful, calculating hand. Opportunity alone did not suffice. The thief possessed skill, patience, and familiarity with both the object and the human responses it might provoke. As the villagers' statements continued, Miss Marple allowed her mind to trace patterns among the interpersonal dynamics. Miss Whittington had spoken quietly to her earlier, revealing a series of long-standing minor grievances, each one ordinary on its own, but collectively suggestive of tension that might motivate someone to act. Mrs. Price's insistence on blaming outsiders suggested discomfort with the idea that the theft could have been orchestrated by someone within the village and a desire to maintain social proprieties. These subtleties, unnoticed by most, were integral to the emerging picture. A new disturbance arose when Miss Whittington noticed a minor detail she had overlooked the day before. One of her gloves was missing, and in its place lay a small fragment of ribbon, the kind used for the doll's hair. The discovery sent a ripple through the assembled crowd, though most dismissed it as trivial. Miss Marple, however, understood its potential significance. It suggested that someone had been at the case and had handled the doll, inadvertently leaving behind a trace. In the context of the previous observations, the scratch, the note, the villager's behavior, it added another subtle thread to the tapestry she was quietly weaving. The adults began to converse in subdued tones, speculating over motives and possible culprits. "It must be someone who resents her," murmured Mrs. Peters, nodding toward Miss Whittington. "But who among us would dare?" Mr. Stringer, impatient and agitated, countered, "Perhaps it is an outsider, someone who has watched for the right moment." Miss Marple listened, noting the anxiety in their voices and the way they projected fears outward, rather than reflecting on their own circumstances. Miss Marple's eyes returned to Lucy, who now held the ribbon fragment, twisting it between her fingers. The child's gaze shifted repeatedly among the adults, pausing longest on Mr. Peters, whose expression stiffened slightly. That hesitation, imperceptible to all but an observer skilled in human behavior, provided the first real pivot point in Miss Marple's analysis. Small gestures, accidental disclosures, and tiny inconsistencies, the elements of truth were revealing themselves, hidden in plain sight. As the morning deepened into early afternoon, Miss Marple rose once more, adjusting her shawl. She moved quietly among the villagers, engaging them in light conversation about trivial matters, allowing her mind to weigh each subtle observation, each hesitated phrase, and each minor physical clue. It was the accumulation of these small details, the scratches, the note, the ribbon fragment, the fleeting expressions of guilt, that was beginning to illuminate the contours of motive and opportunity. By the time the group began to disperse, Miss Marple had reached a quiet certainty. The theft was not random nor impulsive. It was deliberate, planned, and executed with an intimate understanding of both the doll and the human responses it would evoke. And within the fabric of everyday life, threaded with minor grievances and rivalries, the true perpetrator had already revealed themselves in gestures, glances, and omissions. Miss Marple returned to her bench, sitting quietly as the villagers slowly left, each occupied with private thoughts and whispered suspicions. She picked up her knitting, her hands moving in rhythm while her mind traced the outlines of the mystery. The hidden layers, the secret resentments, and the subtle clues were now aligned, and she knew that the next steps would bring the first confrontations and the unraveling of truths that some would prefer to remain concealed. By mid-afternoon, a tense stillness had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, sitting quietly on her bench, observed the villagers as they lingered about the green, some speaking in hushed tones, others lost in private contemplation. The discovery of the ribbon fragment had stirred whispers, and the note found by Lucy Beauchamp had introduced an unsettling sense of deliberate calculation. Miss Marple's attention, however, was focused on the subtler dynamics, the small gestures, the hesitation in speech, the glances exchanged between villagers that betrayed hidden knowledge or restrained emotion. It was these undercurrents that would ultimately reveal the truth. Mr. Peters, whose composure had seemed mild and unremarkable, now displayed subtle signs of agitation. He moved his hands restlessly, brushing invisible dust from his trousers and adjusting the lapel of his jacket as if performing a series of unconscious checks. When Miss Marple's gaze fell upon him, he shifted slightly, his eyes avoiding direct contact, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. Children, she reflected, were often the most honest in observing the world. Adults, by contrast, could hide guilt behind habitual manners and polite facades, yet their smallest movements frequently betrayed them. Mrs. Peters, meanwhile, spoke quietly to a neighbor about Mr. Peters's long-standing envy of the recognition she received for domestic achievements. "He always wanted to be the one noticed," she murmured, as though confiding a secret. "Even over the smallest matters, he seeks approval." Her words, innocuous to casual listeners, resonated with Miss Marple, who had seen similar patterns countless times. Resentment born of perceived slight, culminating in a small, carefully executed act of retribution or attention-seeking. The theft, she now considered, might have been motivated not by material gain alone, but by a desire to assert personal influence. Across the green, Mrs. Price continued to circulate, voicing her suspicions to anyone who would listen. She emphasized the possibility of an outsider, yet her emphasis was revealing in itself. It suggested an inability to accept that someone within the familiar bounds of the village could act with such audacity. Her pronouncements, delivered with a firm, self-righteous air, seemed to Miss Marple more defensive than accusatory, a subtle way of deflecting attention from her own discomfort with the notion of internal deceit. Miss Whittington, holding her gloves nervously, now revealed additional detail. She spoke of a series of minor incidents, seemingly trivial, that had occurred over the past weeks. Misplaced items, subtle rearrangements of furniture, and a general sense that someone had been observing her collection with unusual interest. Each detail, small in isolation, began to coalesce in Miss Marple's mind. They suggested not a random act of mischief, but a deliberate, patient observation preceding the theft. Lucy Beauchamp remained quietly at the edge of the gathering, holding the ribbon fragment and occasionally glancing toward the adults. Miss Marple approached her gently, commenting on the flowers and the warmth of the sun, drawing the child's attention to ordinary matters while observing her reactions to the surrounding villagers. Lucy's small but precise observations, the way she noted who approached the display, who lingered near the doll's case, and who seemed to avoid certain glances, provided Miss Marple with additional, if indirect, insight into the behaviors of the adults. The constable, attempting to restore order and focus, suggested that villagers recount every detail of the previous day's activities near the doll's display. In doing so, more inconsistencies emerged. Mr. Stringer insisted he had remained attentive at his stall throughout the morning, yet a witness mentioned seeing him glance repeatedly toward the doll when he believed no one was watching. Mrs. Peters's attention had been ostensibly fixed on her lemonade stand, yet she had been observed to move briefly behind the tents, closer to the display than she admitted. Such minor deviations, though easily dismissed by casual observers, were precisely the sort of clues Miss Marple valued. It was in the context of these observations that Miss Marple began to form a clearer picture of the events. The theft was not impulsive. It required foresight, knowledge of the villagers' habits, and the careful manipulation of circumstance. The scratch on the case, the note found by Lucy, and the fragment of ribbon all indicated deliberate handling and attention to detail. More importantly, the human behaviors, the hesitations, glances, and small signs of nervousness, pointed toward someone intimately familiar with both the doll and the social dynamics of St. Mary Mead. As the villagers discussed their suspicions, Miss Marple observed how each revealed not only their assumptions about others, but also subtle truths about themselves. Mrs. Price's deflection, Mr. Peters's restlessness, Mrs. Peters's controlled tension, and even Miss Whittington's understated anxiety all contributed to a mosaic of human behavior from which the truth could be inferred. Miss Marple understood that the theft was entwined not merely with opportunity, but with these personal histories, the latent resentments and small ambitions that often went unnoticed until stress revealed them. By late afternoon, she felt that she had gathered enough subtle cues to begin testing her hypothesis. Each movement, each hesitation, and each gesture of discomfort among the villagers was a thread, and Miss Marple intended to follow them with patience and precision. The theft, the note, the minor evidence, all would converge to illuminate the human intention behind the act. The village, with its outward serenity, had revealed its inner complexity, and Miss Marple knew that the next few days would provide the final pieces of the puzzle necessary to uncover the identity of the person who had so carefully orchestrated the curious affair of the antique doll. The next morning, Miss Marple awoke with the familiar sense that a subtle shift had taken place in the village. The theft of the antique doll had stirred not merely curiosity, but a quiet, lingering anxiety, one that colored every movement and glance. She dressed with care, noting the weather's soft chill and the faint breeze that teased the leaves along the garden paths. As she stepped outside, she immediately recognized the familiar rhythm of human behavior, the nervous pacing of those who feared discovery, the casual composure of those seeking to conceal their concern, and the careful attention of those who observed without speaking. Her first stop was the Peters residence. Mrs. Peters had already begun her domestic routines, her movements precise and deliberate, though the faint tension in her shoulders suggested a mind preoccupied. Mr. Peters, meanwhile, appeared to be attending to the garden with unusual diligence, a small shovel in hand, but Miss Marple noted the way he paused repeatedly, glancing toward the windows as though measuring the awareness of his neighbors. Human anxiety, she reflected, rarely went unnoticed when one observed closely enough, and the smallest hesitation often revealed the greatest truths. Over breakfast, Miss Marple allowed casual remarks to guide the conversation. "It is remarkable how quickly the village has taken to speculating about the theft," she said, her tone gentle and unassuming. "Do you not think, Mr. Peters, that sometimes it is the familiar surroundings that offer the most opportunity?" Mr. Peters stiffened imperceptibly, spilling a small measure of tea as he set his cup down. The reaction was so slight that anyone but Miss Marple would have missed it entirely, yet she catalogued it immediately, aware that guilt and discomfort often betrayed themselves in the smallest physical expressions. By mid-morning, she wandered toward the village green, where a small group had gathered under the chestnut trees. Mrs. Price was once more in the midst of conversation, enumerating the possible identities of the thief. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn elsewhere, to the subtle interplay of glances, the tight-lipped smiles, and the occasional flick of fingers that betrayed nervous attention. It was not the loud assertions that carried truth, but the quiet inconsistencies that suggested concealment. Miss Marple's attention returned to Lucy Beauchamp, who had taken up her usual position near the hedge, holding the ribbon fragment with deliberate care. The child's focus was unwavering, and her gaze occasionally rested upon Mr. Peters for longer than politeness required. Miss Marple approached her gently, remarking on the delicate flowers along the hedge. Lucy's small nods and careful observations were recorded silently, every flicker of attention adding to the larger pattern Miss Marple was quietly assembling. The constable, meanwhile, attempted to summon statements from villagers once more, but Miss Marple had already gathered more useful information through quiet observation than any direct questioning could produce. Mr. Stringer, his habitual indignation still evident, had begun pacing near the empty case's original position, muttering about security measures and opportunity. Each repetition, each involuntary glance toward the ground where the doll had been displayed, told Miss Marple as much about the inner state of his mind as any spoken confession could. It was during this period of patient observation that Miss Marple decided to engage in a subtle test. She spoke to Mrs. Peters in casual tones about the management of the fete, complimenting her on the lemonade stand and the tea service. Mrs. Peters responded with measured politeness, yet a flicker of hesitation crossed her face when the subject of the doll was mentioned. Miss Marple, with the softest touch of curiosity, commented on the care with which Mr. Peters had arranged the garden, noting that such meticulous attention could sometimes mask a preoccupation elsewhere. The response she received, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening of the lips and a subtle shift of weight, was precisely the kind of behavior she sought. Those who were innocent tended to relax in the presence of gentle observation, whereas those with secrets revealed themselves through involuntary gestures. Miss Marple catalogued these reactions with care, weaving them into the growing tapestry of evidence, each minute observation a thread connecting motive, opportunity, and temperament. Across the green, Miss Whittington spoke with quiet anxiety to a neighbor, recalling minor incidents over the past weeks. Objects misplaced, subtle rearrangements, a lingering sense of being observed. These admissions, though innocent on the surface, revealed that someone had been carefully studying the doll and its environment, and that the act of theft was not random but calculated. Miss Marple combined this with the knowledge of the scratch on the case, the crumpled note, and the fragment of ribbon forming a clearer image of both the method and the perpetrator's personality. By late morning, Miss Marple had sufficient confidence to test her conclusions with a subtle engagement. She approached Mr. Peters as he adjusted a row of flowers, speaking in gentle tones about human nature and the curiosity that objects often provoke. "It is remarkable," she said, "how much attention a simple doll can command, is it not? One would scarcely imagine the care and thoughtfulness it inspires in some people." Mr. Peters paused, his eyes narrowing briefly, his hand gripping the trowel just a fraction too tightly. The subtle evidence, faint yet undeniable, confirmed the pattern Miss Marple had been piecing together for days. As she returned to her bench beneath the chestnut tree, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The threads were nearly aligned, the motives and opportunity increasingly clear. What had begun as a minor theft was now revealed as an act shaped by human envy, careful planning, and a knowledge of village routines. In the quiet observation of gestures, glances, and inconsistencies, the path toward resolution had been illuminated. The next steps would require delicate maneuvering, but Miss Marple, patient as ever, was prepared. The final revelation, she knew, would soon be within her grasp, and the curious affair of the antique doll would at last yield its secrets. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village green, yet leaving the air taut with anticipation. Miss Marple, seated on her familiar bench beneath the chestnut tree, had watched quietly as the villagers moved about in an uneasy rhythm. The series of observations, minor inconsistencies and subtle gestures she had collected over several days now coalesced into a clear, coherent pattern. It was time, she knew, to bring the strands together, to illuminate the hidden truth that had so carefully eluded every other observer. She rose slowly, knitting needles paused, and addressed the small group that had gathered once more. "I believe," she began in her gentle, measured tone, "that the curious affair of the antique doll may be explained not merely by chance or mischief, but by a combination of opportunity, human temperament, and, unfortunately, resentment that had remained unnoticed until now." A faint murmur ran through the assembled villagers. Some straightened, others glanced at one another with quiet apprehension. Miss Marple allowed them a moment before continuing. "The theft was deliberate, executed with care and understanding of both the object and the people involved. There are several minor details that, when considered together, reveal the person responsible." She held up the fragment of ribbon Lucy Beecham had found, allowing it to catch the light. This small piece, unnoticed by all but a child, indicates someone who had direct access to the doll. The faint scratch on the glass case, so slight that it would escape most eyes, shows deliberate handling, care, not haste. And the note discovered yesterday, folded and left behind, demonstrates not only knowledge of the doll's value, but also an understanding of human reaction. These elements, minor individually, form a consistent picture. Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on Mr. Peters, who now shifted uneasily in his chair. The individual, responsible, is someone who exhibits both patience and calculation, she continued, and whose temperaments incline toward envy or the desire for recognition. We have observed subtle gestures over the past days, hesitations, fleeting glances, the nervous gripping of objects, and the careful manipulation of circumstance. She allowed her words to linger, letting the villagers consider the implications. Turning slightly, she addressed the entire group, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Peters, I believe the evidence points to you." A slight gasp rose from the assembled villagers, though Miss Marple's tone betrayed neither accusation nor triumph. "You were observed near the display more often than you admitted. Your nervous gestures yesterday and today, the unconscious tightening of hands, and your hesitation when the note was discussed, all align with the behavior of someone who wished to manipulate events without immediate detection. The fragment of ribbon, the scratch on the case, and the careful placement of the note were all signs that you approached the doll with calculated intent." Mr. Peters, pale and now fidgeting openly, opened his mouth but found no words. Mrs. Peters glanced at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and unease, while Mr. Stringer muttered something about scandal. Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "I am not here to punish, but to understand. The act, while regrettable, is comprehensible in human terms. Your envy, your desire for recognition, led you to a careful plan that you believed would go unnoticed. Yet even the smallest slip, a glance too long, a sigh too heavy, a hesitation, can reveal more than words ever could." She paused, allowing the lesson to settle. Miss Whittington's minor anxieties, the note, the scratch on the case, the ribbon, all were pieces of a puzzle. Alone, they are meaningless. Together, they demonstrate a consistent pattern. Opportunity alone did not suffice. The act required planning, knowledge of human responses, and careful execution, all of which corresponded with your actions and mannerisms observed over the past days. Mr. Peters, unable to maintain his composure, finally spoke, his voice low and shaken. I did not think it would be noticed. I only wanted to see if I could. To show I did not intend harm." His words faltered, revealing the truth that Miss Marple had already discerned through observation. Miss Marple nodded gently. "I understand, Mr. Peters, and in truth, your actions are as much a reflection of human curiosity and pride as they are of deliberate wrongdoing. It is fortunate that the doll is now unharmed, and that the matter can be resolved with understanding rather than recrimination." She glanced at Lucy, who offered a small, proud smile, the child having unwittingly contributed to the resolution through her careful attention. The villagers, though still murmuring, gradually settled, reassured by Miss Marple's calm exposition and her ability to render the incident comprehensible in human terms. Mr. Stringer muttered something about village pride, but stopped when Miss Marple's serene gaze met his. Mrs. Peters released a small sigh, a mix of relief and lingering concern, while Miss Whittington, pale but composed, clutched her gloves and nodded, expressing silent gratitude for the return of both the doll and her peace of mind. Miss Marple, satisfied that the situation had been resolved, returned to her bench. She picked up her knitting, her hands moving in the familiar rhythm while her mind reflected on the delicate intricacies of human nature. The affair had begun with a simple object, a doll, yet it had revealed layers of subtle emotion, hidden rivalry, and unnoticed gestures. It was, she thought, a reminder that human behavior often spoke louder than any words or confessions, and that observation, patience, and gentle reasoning could uncover truths that might otherwise remain hidden. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden shadows across the village green, St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its tranquil rhythm. The tension of the theft dissolved into a quiet understanding, and the villagers went about their day with the usual mixture of gossip and routine. Miss Marple, knitting serenely, allowed herself a small, private smile. The curious affair of the antique doll had been unraveled, its mysteries exposed, and in doing so, she had once again demonstrated the subtle yet penetrating power of patient observation and understanding of the human heart.